Dear students, welcome to this lecture. In today's lecture, we will be discussing the debates of feminism in South Asia. The lecture will focus on the following questions. What is the nature of feminism in South Asia? How is feminism in South Asia different from Western feminism? And what are the objectives of feminism in different South Asian countries? Dear students, before discussing feminism in South Asia, let us first clarify what feminism means. All over the world, there has been a close link between the women's movements or activism and feminism, each inspiring and enriching the other. While the women's movement is a much earlier phenomenon, the term feminism is a modern one. Feminism consists of a number of social, cultural and political movements, theories and moral philosophies challenging gender inequalities and propagating equal rights for women. It is defined as both an intellectual commitment and a political movement that seeks justice for women and the end of sexism in all forms. Feminism at its core is about equality, not sameness. Many people argue that women are not same as men, so there cannot be equality. The issue here is about equal rights and equal access to opportunities. Men and women do not have to be same in physicality to have the right to equality. Thus, the goal of feminism and the political work of women's movements is to bring an end to gender inequality based on biological differences between men, women and other genders. Let us now move to feminism in South Asia. South Asian countries in contemporary times are concurrent with SAARC, South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation. The modern history of this region is enmeshed with the experience of British colonialism. The colonial encounter of more than 2 centuries has brought out the tussle between tradition and modernity in contemporary South Asian societies. This tussle is most evident when it comes to the question of women's rights. As such, it is only natural that the post-colonial states in South Asia have become the location of women's activism and focus of diverse feminist scholarship lately. Kumari Jayawardena, in her classic book Feminism and Nationalism in the Third World, argued that feminism was not a Western import but emerged organically in many parts of the once colonized world through anti-imperial struggles. Across all South Asian countries, patriarchal values and social norms tend to privilege men in access to opportunities and control over resources. Since at least the 1980s, feminists in South Asia have offered parallel insights as they analyze the place of gender in South Asian history and society and debated their relationship with Western feminism. However, Maitreyi Chaudhary argues that there is a very rich body of writing on women's activism, but a sparseness of theoretical writing on feminism in India, a gap that in her view may be explained by the existing international academic division of labor, which presumes that theorization is the preserve of Western concern and expertise. South Asian feminists have offered major revisions of other scholarly disciplines and areas of inquiry, most notably literature, law, economics, and sociology, and they also intervened in established modes of activism and organizing. The spectacular rise of communalism, sectarian violence, and militarism has necessitated a continued feminist engagement with histories of religious identity, community, and social memory. In order to develop an integrated understanding of gender issues in South Asia, it is important to contextualize it in the prevailing socio-economic, religious, and geopolitical conditions, account for the fact that constitutional guarantees and legal provisions do not automatically lead to implementation, and acknowledge that discrimination persists within the family and societal institutions. There remains a serious gap between legislation, policy, and practice when it comes to women's rights in South Asia. At first glance, South Asia appears rich in cultural constructs such as family ties, social networks, and economic relations, as well as assumptions of social harmony and pursuit of spiritual over material values. However, underlying this idealistic conceptualization is the harsh reality of divisions and discriminations based on gender, class, caste, creed, religion, and socio-economic disparities. Women in South Asia are not a homogeneous group. They are heterogeneous as they are a product of their society, which is also heterogeneous. A vast majority of South Asian women fall prey to gendered socialization that begins at birth and continues throughout their lives, making most women feel that striving for equality is either immoral or a sin. The majority of South Asian women are not free agents who are empowered to make their own life choices, ranging from education, marriage, employment, family planning, and financial investments. There is also a disconnect between the Western and Eastern notion of gender, largely due to a perceived dissimilarity in culture. In the eyes of many in South Asia, the concept of equality is an alien import that goes against the stereotypical imaging of women, that projects her subservience as a virtue and celebrates her sacrifices as an act of nobility. In such an indigenous and intersectional context, feminism as a specific movement in South Asia must be studied independently. Let us now focus on the major differences between Western feminism and South Asian feminism. Historically, feminism has been viewed from a restricted and universal Western lens. Like any other concept in political theory, gender in South Asia was being studied from a Western perspective. This did not truly represent the everyday reality of a woman living in the Third World generally, or South Asia specifically. Third World women are often seen as powerless, victimized group in comparison to liberated Western women. This victimization of Third World women as agency-less individuals results in creating the biases of North-South divide, West and non-West divide. This further creates an impediment for the emergence of an inclusive transnational feminist movement. However, as more women of different nationalities, races, religions, classes and cultures have started speaking out their stories, the feminist discourse is expanding to include the voices of those who have been previously excluded. This promotes a postmodernist and post-colonial perspective of feminism, which acknowledges diversity in the movement and accepts multiple truths, roles and realities as part of its focus. It lets marginal groups of women reconceptualize feminism based on their own lived experiences. Post-colonial feminism is a critical approach to theory that aims at the legacies of colonialism and their ongoing effects on women and gender. It seeks to understand and interpret everyday lived experiences through a post-colonial lens, decentering the white, Western and Eurocentric experience. Post-colonial feminists like Chandra Talpare Mohanty claim that Western feminists tend to rely only on their value system and view themselves as saviors of other women. By assuming that global sisterhood exists, they fail to realize that the women across the world do not necessarily share the same conditions of discrimination as women in Western countries. Her thesis is that Western feminism has a habit of treating third world women as a homogeneous group, thereby creating a singular idea of the average third world woman as sexually constrained, uneducated, domestic, victimized, bound by family and tradition, and unaware of her subjugation. Mohanty writes, Western feminists appropriate and colonize the fundamental complexities and conflicts which characterize the lives of women of different classes, religions, races, and castes in these countries. It is in the process of homogenization and systematization of the oppression of women in the third world that power is exercised in much of recent Western feminist discourse, and this power needs to be defined and named. The homogeneous approach to non-Western women is an act of colonialism in Western feminist discourse. Discursive colonialism is the creation of an ahistorical and stereotyped image of third world women. Through her works, Mohanty is deconstructing the idea of first world woman as subject and third world woman as object. The deconstruction of this presumed universal feminist subject, woman, has been a cornerstone of many debates within feminist theorizing in South Asia. Such debates have resulted in major analysis of gender essentialism and the reconstitution of feminist agency in the region. Religion and caste are just two of the categories that have encouraged fundamental rethinking about the problem of difference and its relationship to definitions of the feminist subject. In South Asia today, the problem of difference is refracted through growing identitarian movements, particularly through violent, militaristic, religious and ethnic nationalisms which are escalating across the region. This post-colonial reconceptualization of the South Asian woman and their intersectional identity makes feminism in South Asia different from and broader than Western feminism. With this background of differences between Western feminism and South Asian feminism, let us now look at the objectives of feminism in different South Asian countries. The undeniable fact of the plural composition of South Asian countries and plethora of communities and societies compels us to acknowledge an intersectional imagination of feminism in the region. It is one thing to say that the homogeneous and universal model of Western feminism cannot address the issues of South Asian women. And it is another thing to say that there cannot be similarly any one monolith model of South Asian feminism. So, let us take an overview of aims of feminism in each South Asian country. Feminism in India. Dear students, it could be said that Indian women's movements worked for two goals. One, liberation or upliftment of women, that is, reforming social practices so as to enable women to play a more important and constructive role in society. And two, equal rights for men and women, that is, extension of rights enjoyed by men in the political, economic and familial spheres to women also. The beginning of women's movements in India can be traced back to the 19th century social change movements in the colonial period. After independence, women's movements gained momentum, resulting in spread of various women's organizations working for the upliftment of different sections of women. However, mainstream women's movements were criticized for representing only upper caste, upper and middle class, urban, educated Hindu women. As a result, Dalit feminism emerged as a separate movement for the empowerment of Dalit women in India. This movement was hugely inspired by the black feminist movements of the West and wanted to expose the intersectionality of caste, class and gender identities of Indian women. Since independence and especially 1990s, after India adopted new economic policy of liberalization, a group of Indian feminists like Vandana Shiva have created a developmental critique of Indian economic model. This has led to the emergence of women environmental activism and rise of ecofeminism in the country. Feminism in Pakistan. Dear students, in the early years of Pakistan's formation, the wounds inflicted by the blood-stained partition were fresh. Women activists were focused on welfare issues such as the rehabilitation of refugees, because that kind of work had social respectability within the traditional cultural milieu. Pakistan also inherited many social issues such as polygamy, honor killing, child marriage, inheritance, divorce, and the right to education from the pre-partition times. Many of the demands for social and legal reforms on these issues were acceptable even within the bounds of true religion. So there was no fear of women demanding their equal rights with men in a society based on modern and Western notions of justice and fair play. The 1960s saw the proliferation of women's welfare and development organizations in Pakistan, but it was the All Pakistan Women's Association (APWA) that became the face of the women's movement in the country in that decade. APWA's approach was characterized by two salient features. One, the focus on social welfare and development work involving girls' education and income generation activities. And two, the collaboration with the state to achieve its aims. The feminist movement in the 1980s was spearheaded by Women's Action Forum (WAF) in the urban areas and Sindhyani Tehreek in rural Sindh. WAF struggled for a democratic, inclusive, plural and secular state, while Sindhiani Tehreek strove for an end to feudalism and patriarchy. However, present-day feminism is more pluralistic and accepting in terms of gender, sexuality, race, class and religion than its past editions. Several laws on women's empowerment, sexual harassment at the workplace, honor killings and even domestic violence have been passed in recent times. However, a lot more still needs to be done. Feminism in Sri Lanka. Dear students, there was not only a women's movement in 20th century Sri Lanka, but there was also a consciousness about women's issues in the 19th century. Women writers and poets raised issues that dealt with women's subordination and also challenged patriarchal structures. Women's education expanded along with opportunities for employment, including the emergence of the first women doctors in the 1890s. But it was in the early 20th century, perhaps also inspired by talk about suffragettes and women's rights in the West and in India, that Sri Lankan women started campaigning for the right to vote, which was obtained in 1931. The women's movement in Sri Lanka was ongoing from the 1930s to the 1990s. While it was a continuation of the earlier movement, in another sense, the 1970s marked a new phase in which activists talked about feminism, patriarchy and violence against women, issues that had not been debated earlier. In 2017, the government made various national commitments to gender equality, including an elaboration on the National Action Plan to address sexual and gender-based violence, and introduced the National Framework for Women-Headed Households, given 1 in 4 households in Sri Lanka is headed by women and of which half are widowed. Persistent challenges facing women include the difficulties of juggling family responsibilities with paid work, traditional attitudes towards women, limited access to finances, inadequate parental leave policies, and inadequate skills for the modern labor market. The women's groups also gave the peace movement a big push. A group called Women for Peace, which started in the 1980s in Sri Lanka, took out a half-page advertisement in the newspaper with 100 prominent women in Sri Lanka signing for peace. Feminism in Bangladesh. Dear students, after the independence of Bangladesh in 1971, the question of women's rights was one of the most important issues for the Mujibur Rahman government. In 1970s, Sufia Kamal founded Bangladesh Mahila Parishad, the country's oldest women's rights organization till date. Ever since, the organization has been a dominant force in shaping the roles of Bangladeshi women in politics and society. The first 5-year plan of Bangladesh only identified the need for women's development in terms of motherhood and rehabilitation of war victims. To overcome the gap, Raunak Jahan founded Women for Women in 1973. Known as one of the first feminist organizations focusing on research and advocacy, it published the first comprehensive report on challenges faced by women. Throughout the 70s, there was a growing consciousness of the varied experiences of women across Bangladesh. With the establishment of Bachte Shekha, Learn How to Survive, one of the largest women and children's development organizations in 1976, the scope of the women's movement was expanded beyond the urban upper and middle class. In the 1990s, a new form of organizing amongst women's rights organizations seemed to emerge. There was a focus on physical and sexual violence experienced by women in public and private spheres. Nari Pokho, a collective of women's rights activists, played a significant role in establishing the issue of violence against women as a determinant for their position in society and starting national dialogue around women's bodily rights, including sexual rights. Today, Nari Pokho has expanded their focus to issues surrounding gender and health care, environment and political empowerment. Nari Pokho has also been a strong ally in the fight for sex workers' rights in Bangladesh. Following the evictions of sex workers from brothels in the late 1990s, sex workers mobilized and became more politically active in the context of the women's movement. This led to the formation of ULCA, an organization that aimed to destigmatize the life and work of sex workers. Feminism in Nepal. Dear students, Nepal Women Association, also referred as NWA, was formed under the leadership of Mangala Devi in 1947 as first political women organization in the country. The NWA encouraged delegation team to visit Prime Minister's office immediately after its formation and demanded right to vote and education for women. A prominent political leader, Pushpalal Shrestha, popularly known as Pushpalal, took initiatives to form Nepal Communist Party in 1949, which raised the issues of gender equality in all spheres of the human life, including equal wage for equal work, maternity leave for women, crèche and free education for children. With these demands, more women were motivated to be part of anti-Rana regime movement in 1951. With the participation of women, the 104 years long oligarchy Rana system were overthrown, which resulted in the establishment of multi-party democracy. After the change in system, women got various rights such as suffrage, education, equality before laws. Women's movement was influenced by the liberal feminist perspective in those days, and women's social and constitutional status has changed little bit. In the early phase of 21st century, women's movement was already demanding for equal rights to dissent, property and participation in policy making. Similarly, the issues such as our body, ourselves, recognition of women as half of the workforce, inclusion of marginalized group in decision-making body, etc. have been mainstreamed. Constitution of Nepal 2015 is big achievement for the Nepali women, but its proper enforcement is a real challenge, because in the past there were many good provisions in national policy and law regarding gender justice which were not interpreted and implemented in proper way. This doubt is still there. Feminism in Afghanistan. Dear students, relatively it was observed that steady progression for women's rights in Afghanistan was experienced under the communist influence of Soviet Union. But the civil conflict between Mujahideen groups and government forces in the 80s and 90s and then under Taliban rule, women in Afghanistan had their rights increasingly rolled back. Afghan women became victims of this decades-long Islamization and radicalization. Taliban espoused the Deobandi ideology, which has roots in conservatism and orthodoxy of puritanical Islam. This Deobandi interpretation of Sharia led to harsher gender norms and gender laws in Afghanistan. Compulsory head-to-toe covering for women, no co-education, strict gender segregation, women requiring male chaperone for travel became the mandatory gender practices. In 2011, it was named the most dangerous country to be a woman in. Currently, Taliban, which regained power in Afghanistan in 2021, publicly acknowledges the rights of women, but has tongue-twisted it by making them subservient to Afghan culture. Afghan women are still fighting for their rights under Islam. Feminism in Afghanistan is a form of Islamic feminism which believes that gender empowerment and gender equality can be achieved within the values of Islam. Feminism in Bhutan. Dear students, traditionally, cultural beliefs and practices posed inherent discrimination against women in education, employment, health, politics and rule of law in Bhutan. Thus, gender issues still need to be worked out culturally and politically. Then there is the issue of women not being allowed to enter a goenkhang, an inner sanctum of a temple or monastery. Many Bhutanese women appear to have accepted it, even though a few have questioned the rationality of such practices. The prevalence and tolerance of domestic violence is another issue. There is no accurate data on gender-based violence, and due to underreporting, information available from police and hospital sources is not truly indicative of the overall domestic violence situation. Reports claim that women have been an integral part of development in Bhutan, but if the representation of women in politics, governance and leadership is an indication, there is much more to be done. It is evident that gender-neutral laws have never provided a level playing field, and women's participation in politics has not at all been encouraged. Feminism in Maldives. Dear students, gender differentials exist in some degree across all spheres of Maldivian life. Over the past 2 decades, the government's approach to gender development has changed from a focus on empowerment and integration to one of gender equality and mainstreaming. The reality of gender equality in Maldives is dichotomous. In the public realm, gender equality, including situations where women fare better than men, exists in education, health, survival and labor force participation, where fairly liberal and egalitarian laws, policies and institutions appear to enable relative gender equality. In contrast, in the private sphere, where social conservatism is more dominant and consequently Sharia law is more likely to be followed, there is a steady shift towards gender inequality in gender relations, power and roles within the household and in intimate relationships such as in marriage, including divorce and intimate partner violence, and in the division of decision making and assets between spouses. increasing social conservatism and this dichotomy between gender differentials in the private and public spheres of life could slow and even reverse Maldives' gains in gender equality in education, health, and other developmental outcomes. The future of gender equality is thus an immediate developmental concern for Maldives. To conclude, the feminist struggles in South Asian countries can largely be understood through following lenses. 1. The history of colonial modernity, examples of which can be seen in reformist movements in colonial India. 2. The Islamic religious epistemology, largely in countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Maldives, and to some extent in India, resulting in rise of Islamic feminism. 3. The practice of caste system as a hierarchical division of human society, manifesting in the emergence of Dalit feminism in India. 4. The epistemology and lived experiences of peace and conflict of active zones of confrontation between people and state in many regions like India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka. 5. The activism for reforms and constitutional safeguards by modern nation states. 6. The criticism of states' development model, especially since the 1990s, resulting in displacement of indigenous tribal population emerging in the rise of ecofeminism. What this basically means is that feminism in South Asia is just as diverse as the region itself. Therefore, one can see a mosaic of different types of feminism flourishing in the region according to their different objectives in different countries. Broadly speaking, one can see the emergence of Dalit feminism in India, the spread of Islamic feminism in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Maldives, and Afghanistan, the rise of ecofeminism as a critique of state development model across countries due to the crisis of climate change and the influence of green politics, and increasing popularity of post-colonial feminism as a critique of Western feminism. Since 2000s, there has been a new phase of feminism in South Asia with the Me Too movement, which gained huge ground in India and Pakistan. Dear students, today many of feminist voices in and about South Asia seek a more organic connection between theory and practice. Thus, many scholars are participants in actual campaigns and struggles, while many activists have produced salient pieces of scholarship. Overall, feminism in South Asia is still evolving, and one may see emergence of many other kinds of feminism in future. Dear students, I hope you enjoyed the lecture on debates of feminism in South Asia. Thank you.